Never max out your budget when it comes to buying a home. And the primary reason for that is because your housing payment is going to continue to get more expensive over time. Now I can already hear what you're saying. Jeb, you always say one of the biggest benefits of home ownership is that you're able to fix your housing costs. Yes, that is true. But it's not 100% the truth. And that's because rising costs in insurance, HOA fees, as well as your property taxes could turn that dream home into a financial nightmare. So stick with me today as we learn why maxing out your budget now could actually cost you big time in the future. But before we dive into that, I'd like to take a minute and ask a favor. If you find any value in the content that I do here on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. And if you want to stay updated on everything real estate and mortgage related, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Now I want to set the episode today by going back on one of the things I said just a moment ago. One of the biggest benefits of home ownership is fixing your housing costs. And the earlier you can do that in your life, the better off you're going to be long term. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Jeb, well, you just said your housing costs aren't fixed because things like insurance, property taxes, HOA fees could continue to increase over time. And you're exactly right. But the benefits of home ownership on top of fixing that principal and interest payment is that you're likely gaining appreciation while putting money into a forced savings account by paying down the principal balance of that mortgage. Now I can understand what you might be thinking here. You might be thinking, well, if I rent is actually going to be cheaper than owning a home. Therefore, it doesn't make any sense to buy a home. But in today's video, we're going to also talk about why renting is likely going to get more expensive. There's no such thing as a 30-year fixed payment when it comes to rent. And we'll also discuss why those rising fees that I mentioned earlier are likely going to be passed to you over time, making renting even that much more expensive. Now, before we dive too deep in today's episode, I want to talk about how a mortgage payment is made up, because I think it's really, really important for you as a homeowner, for you as a potential buyer to understand what goes into your actual monthly payment. Now, for the majority of people out there, they're going to be doing a 30-year fixed loan, which means they're paying principal and interest every single month when they're making their monthly mortgage payment. Now, the nice thing about a 30-year fixed mortgage is that that principal and interest payment that you're making is fixed. That payment does not change over the life of that loan. But on top of that principal and interest payment, you're going to have things like property taxes. You're going to have things like homeowners insurance. If you're buying a property that's in a community where it has a homeowners association, you're going to have that fee as well. And when it comes to qualifying to buy a home, your mortgage professional, when they're going through that process of determining how much home you can actually afford, they're looking at this total monthly payment, what that principal and interest payment is, how much your property taxes, how much your insurance is, how much the HOA fees. If you're buying a loan and you're putting less than 20% down, there's a high likelihood that you're also going to have mortgage insurance. So all of those fees are taken into account when determining how much home you can afford. Now, here's the problem that a lot of first-time home buyers make. They go into the process without having a budget. They go into the process relying on their mortgage lender, their mortgage professional in many cases, to actually tell them how much home they can afford to purchase based off the guidelines that the lender sets. Now, that's where I want to take a break here and actually explain something. A lender qualifies you to buy a home based off your debt to income ratio, how much monthly debt you have versus how much income you bring in every month. And that gives us something called a debt to income ratio. And depending on the type of loan program you're doing, you're looking somewhere around 50% of your gross monthly income before any taxes of being able to afford a home. But part of that monthly debt that they're considering is not only the things that show up on your credit report, like your car payments, your credit cards, your student loans, the loan that you got to buy furniture for your new house, but they're also taking into consideration your new monthly housing payment. And part of that housing payment is that principal and interest payment, are those property taxes, that homeowner's insurance, that HOA, all of those things combined makes up your debt to income ratio. And here's where a lot of first-time home buyers get it wrong. They actually go up to the max that the lender will allow them to qualify for in order to be able to buy more homes. Because housing prices are so expensive at the moment, interest rates are high, you actually get a lot less home for your dollar, which is leading a lot of homeowners to want to push that budget. They want to get more bang for their buck. They want to get more property, if you will, and therefore they end up maxing out their budget without ever actually having a budget. They never took the time to create a budget to figure out how much home they could actually afford. They never factored in their groceries. They never factored in how much they spend on date night. They never factored in how much they paid the babysitter. They just said, hey, the lender said I can afford a $5,000 mortgage payment. Therefore, I'm going to go buy the house that comes to a $5,000 mortgage payment. But here's what happens over time. Your housing expenses continue to increase, which in turn could put you in a tough financial position. And that's really where I want to spend a little bit of time today, talking about why you shouldn't be maxing out your budget. Now, here's the thing. Over time, your wages are going to continue to increase. At the moment, wages are increasing somewhere between 3 and 4% annually, which means if you make $100,000 per year, that means next year you're in theory making $103,000, $104,000. If you make $50,000 a year, you're now making $51,500 or $52,000. So in most parts of the country, that increase in wages is going to outweigh the increase that we're talking about here with regards to your monthly housing payment. But in some areas of the country, that's not necessarily the case, and that's exactly what we've seen with things like rising insurance costs, rising property taxes. These are things that you can't really plan for, if you will, because you don't really know what the future holds. But at least if you have a little bit of grace when it comes to your budget, if these things do increase, at least you're in a position where you're not completely maxed out. And I want to take a minute here and explain how property taxes work in most parts of the country. So what happens is when you buy a home, you're paying property taxes essentially based off the price that you're paying for that home. Now, the county actually assesses that property a little bit differently, but when it comes to paying your property taxes, you're more or less paying them based off the new value of your home. Now, if you're lucky enough to live here in California where I am, we actually have something called Prop 13 that essentially keeps your property taxes from rising more than 2% per year, which means over time, your property taxes aren't really going to increase that much. But in other areas of the country, what happens is as new homes sell in your neighborhood, as the county starts to assess those, that increases the value of your property taxes. So you could have purchased your home at, say, $100,000, and because now you've owned that home, say 20, 30 years, and homes around you are now selling for, say, $1 million, well, guess what? You're paying the same property taxes as those new homeowners that are buying in your neighborhood, which means if you were on a fixed budget when you originally bought that home, which means that rise in property taxes has completely blown up your budget. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of areas across the United States, along with rising insurance costs in states like Florida, Louisiana, around the Gulf of Texas. All of these areas that are prone to natural disasters like hurricanes, fires, that sort of thing, are starting to see large increases in the annual premiums, which in turn is causing a huge increase in monthly housing payments. In addition to that, if you're buying a home that's located inside of a homeowners association, maybe it's a condo, maybe you're buying a single family home and it's in a community that is maintained by a management company, if you will, well, guess what? As we have inflation, as costs rise over time, guess what happens to that budget within the HOA? That budget increases because they have to pay the vendors in that community, which means in order to meet that budget, they have to pass that rising cost along to you. So just think you live in a state where they reassess your property taxes based on your neighbors. You live in that same state that is prone to natural disasters, and you live in that same state that's having increases in HOA fees. Well, all those things combined could create a financial nightmare. And another reason it's super important to budget because the lender isn't taking some of the things that I'm going to talk about right now into account when they're telling you how much home you can afford. They're only looking at the principal and interest payment, the taxes, the insurance, the HOA fees. What they're not taking into account is how much you're going to be paying in gas, how much you're going to be paying in electric. And over time, those fees are also going to continue to increase. In addition, you're likely to have maintenance and repair costs. And these are things that you need to build into your budget. Now, in no way am I trying to dissuade you from buying a home. I'm more trying to make you aware of these things. Buying a home is an emotional process. And what happens is people get emotionally involved and they just push everything else to the side because they want to buy that home. And they don't think about these additional things that need to be factored in. They're over here maxing out their budget. They're not thinking that they don't have an emergency fund in case something happens. So just keep in mind when you are deciding to buy a home that you do have some money set aside, that you're not using every single bit of it to buy the home. And you also have to be comfortable with the payment. You have to go into buying that home with the expectation that that payment is basically the same and could go up over time. Now, there might be an opportunity in the future to refinance, to a lower rate to take down that principal and interest payment, which is one of the biggest benefits of home ownership because you don't get to refinance a rent payment, right? Rent typically goes up 3 to 5% every single year, whereas homeowners have had the luxury over the last 40 years of being in a bull market when it comes to mortgage rates. Mortgage rates have continued to decline over the last 40 years or so. And over that 40-year period of time, homeowners have been able to refinance and lower their monthly payment while building appreciation, while paying down that principal. And the earlier you can do this in your life, the better off you're going to be, because what's going to happen is over time, your wages are going to increase. You're likely going to continue to make more money over time. So the earlier you can do it, the better off you're going to be, because that housing payment, everything associated with it, is going to make up less and less of your income over time. But that in no way means that you should max out your budget to start, that you should just go in and throw all common sense out the window just to become a homeowner. While I do think homeownership is one of the most important things you can do in your life, going about it the right way is also extremely, extremely important. So if you're planning on buying a house, just make sure you have a longer term time horizon. Make sure you have money in the bank. Make sure you're comfortable with the monthly payment, and also make sure you're doing it for the right reasons.